The heavy thud of an iron-bound chest hitting the frozen ground, the snap of a broken lock. Inside, the dull gleam of silver, German denarii. In the year 1039, that sound is all that remains of Polish statehood. On a high hill stands a man looking down. The wind carries from the valley the persistent stench of old smoke and rotting wood. The man stares at where, not long ago, the spiritual capital of his ancestors once stood, the city of Gniezno. Now there are no walls. The roof of the first Christian cathedral is smashed in, and on the broken altars, as the Chronicles dryly note, wild beasts make their lairs. This man's name is Casimir. He is a Piast, the rightful heir to the throne. But his return from exile has nothing to do with the beautiful legends of a triumphant hero riding into a saved city on a white horse to the cheers of a crowd. There is no one left to cheer, nothing left to save. Behind Casimir's stand no loyal Polish regiments. There stand foreign men, infantry and knights clad in heavy armor, speaking German. Casimir did not return home as a liberator. He arrived as a crisis manager, stepping out of a wagon to survey a factory that has burned to the ground. History likes to speak of states as something sacred. We like to believe that sovereignty is born from the blood of heroes, ancient oaths, and divine providence. But sometimes a state is just a business project, a bankrupt corporation torn to pieces by its competitors. And to restart that machine, sacred rights aren't enough. You need startup capital. You need armed contractors. The paradox of Casimir, whom descendants would call the Restorer, lies in one brutal truth. To become an independent ruler, he first had to sell himself into political slavery. He had to go and bow before the chief enemy of his grandfather and take the country on credit. In this episode, we won't see beautiful knightly tournaments or religious pathos. This is a story about the accounting of sovereignty, about how logistics, mercenaries, and geopolitical contracts replace national pride. We will trace how Casimir reclaims the scorched earth, meter by meter, eliminating competitors who have built their own successful startups on the ruins. But the main question we must answer is, can you even buy a dead country back? And what is the hidden price of that deal? A price that will forever change the very DNA of the state. To grasp the scale of the task facing Casimir, you only need to look at the political map of Eastern Europe in the late 1030s. The word Poland simply isn't on it. There is a gaping void. In the south, in wealthy Silesia, stand the garrisons of the Bohemian Duke Bretislav. He took these lands as a trophy. In the north, the Pomeranian tribes have thrown off their crosses, killed the priests, and returned to the old gods. In the east, beyond the Vistula in Mazovia, sits a former princely official who took advantage of the anarchy and built his own independent dictatorship. And in the very center of the country, in Greater Poland, wild forest, peasant revolts, and ashes. The old machine of power, which the Piasts had built for nearly a century, has been physically destroyed. It cannot be repaired. It must be designed and assembled from scratch. But for that, Kazimierz needs metal. And I'm not just talking about swords. To see where this resource comes from, we need to leave the smoking ruins of Gniezno and travel far to the west, to where the smooth marble floors reflect the light of hundreds of candles, and the fates of entire nations are decided in quiet voices. To the court of the German Emperor. Smooth polished marble, gleaming like ice. After the muddy, rutted roads carved by carts, and the acrid stench of damp smoke that seems permanently embedded in the cloaks of refugees, this imperial splendor stings the eyes. Beneath the high vaulted ceilings, the air smells of beeswax, expensive Rhenish wine, and absolute, unshakable power. In the year 1039, we find ourselves in Goslar, the residence of Henry III, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And here, waiting for an audience, stands a young man. He has no retinue, no gold, no country. His name is Casimir. He is a Piast, the rightful heir to a Polish throne that now exists only as ashes. If you recall his family's recent history, this scene looks like a cruel joke. Just one generation ago, his grandfather, Boleslaw the Brave, received the German Emperor Otto in his capital as an equal. They gave his grandfather the spear of St. Maurice, placed a diadem on his head, and called him brother and ally of the empire. The Piasts dictated their will to all of Central Europe. Now Bolesław's grandson stands in the waiting room, a poor relation, an exile who has come to beg for soldiers and money from the very people who spent decades trying to break the back of the Polish state. The German barons passing by likely don't look at him with respect, more like with disgusted curiosity. Anyone else in Casimir's place might have been broken by this humiliation, or, on the contrary, started making pompous speeches about the ancient rights of his dynasty and demanding justice. But Casimir is silent. He's not prone to emotions at all. Casimir is a cold calculator. He understands perfectly. His royal pride is currently worth less than the dust on his boots. To buy his country back from the scrap heap of history, he needs startup capital. Without it, he'll remain just a wandering nobleman with a famous last name. The doors to the throne room open. Emperor Henry III has no intention of helping the Polish prince out of charity or Christian compassion. In 11th century politics, such concepts don't exist. On the contrary, a weak, torn-apart Poland was always beneficial to the empire. The fewer problems on the eastern frontier, the better you sleep in Goslar. But geopolitics is the math of balance, and that balance has just been brutally disrupted. News has already reached Henry that the Bohemian prince Bretislaus has wiped Greater Poland off the map and annexed wealthy Silesia. What's more, Bretislaus has become so bold that he's started minting his own coins from the looted Polish silver, without even asking his overlord's permission. Bohemia is rapidly turning into a dangerous, hungry super-predator right on the empire's borders. Henry urgently needs a counterweight to put this insolent Bohemian vassal in his place. He needs a force that will strike Bretislaus in the rear and tie him down in a constant war. And Casimir, ready to do anything to reclaim his throne, is the perfect fit for this role. The deal struck beneath the vaults of Goslar has nothing to do with heroic myths about saving the homeland. It's a harsh, cynical corporate contract. Casimir officially renounces the independent ambitions of his grandfather. He swears an oath of fealty and acknowledges himself a vassal of the German crown. He gives away his political freedom. In exchange, the emperor opens his arsenals to him. What happens next forever changes the rules of the game for the Polans. In the inner courtyard of the castle, an army assembles. 1,000 heavily armed German knights. This isn't a peasant militia with axes or light Slavic cavalry. This is a professional, elite killing machine. The rhythmic, heavy clang of German steel pounds against the ears. Long kite shields, mail hauberks reaching to the knees, heavy lances. Alongside the cavalry, supply wagons line up. Iron-bound chests, heavy and solid, are loaded onto the carts. Inside, full-weight imperial silver. That venture capital without which no mercenary will take a single step. Casimir's state currently exists physically inside those chests. For a piast to take German swords and German money to go cut down his own countrymen, that's the ultimate price. But Casimir makes this choice without flinching. Sovereignty is not a sacred right granted by heaven. It's an asset. And right now, Casimir is taking out a mortgage on it, using his own country as collateral. The column of heavy cavalry begins to move. 1,000 knights and a long line of supply wagons slowly advance eastward. Casimir rides at the head. He finally has the tool to reassemble the broken machinery of power. But he is bringing onto Polish soil men who don't know the local language, despise local customs, and serve only the clink of silver in those chests. They cross the border and enter Greater Poland, the place where the wooden earth ramparts and stone churches of his ancestors once stood. But what the German mercenaries see when they arrive instinctively makes them grip their sword hilts a little tighter. Heavy cavalry crosses the border without a single shot fired. In the year 1030, steel, followed by supply wagons loaded with provisions and imperial silver. The soldiers hold formation. They grip their sword hilts, expecting an ambush from the dense thicket at any moment. They're ready for local partisans or fanatical pagans to spring on them. But the forest is silent. No one offers resistance, because there's no one left to resist. The roads, where just 10 years ago merchant caravans and mounted tax collectors moved without pause, are now thickly overgrown with tall grass. The strained creaking of heavily laden cartwheels echoes for miles around, but no one comes out to investigate. A persistent heavy smell of old smoke hangs in the air. The autumn rains and winter snows couldn't wash it away. Casimir rides through his country, conducting the first inventory in years. What he sees isn't just destruction from a Czech raid, it's systemic collapse. Here's Poznan, the cradle of his dynasty, of the massive oak and earth ramparts 20 meters thick. Only melted, slumped hills remain. The stone chambers are razed to the ground. Here's Gniezno, the coronation site of his grandfather, the spiritual capital that drove all the early Piast politics. The Czechs hauled everything out of here, from holy relics to lead roofs. The Chronicles note this detail without emotion. In the ruined basilica, right among the debris of golden altars, wild beasts now sleep. Any medieval ruler in Casimir's place would have fallen onto those stones, started praying, and sworn to restore his ancestors' shrines at any cost. Tradition and monarchical honor demanded it. But Casimir doesn't pray. He thinks in terms of crisis management. To keep 1,000 German knights fighting, you need to feed them, supply them with fodder, and pay them on time. In old Poland, this was done through a sprawling network of fortified towns. Peasants brought grain, honey, and furs there, and from there, resources went to support the prince's retinue. Now that system is dead. The peasants have scattered. Those who stayed have reverted to slash-and-burn farming, and the old gods, they're no longer plugged into any economy. There's no one to collect taxes, no place to store them. And the key point, you can't just fix the old machine by issuing a new decree. You can't command ruins to become a tax center again. Casimir surveys the charred skeletons of Gniezno. He does the math quickly in his head. Rebuilding the capital here, in the middle of hostile forests, far from surviving trade routes, would eat up all his imperial credit money before he even started a real war to reunite the country. And he makes a decision, absolutely bookkeeping, pragmatic, and shocking to his contemporaries. He writes off Gniezno as a loss. Casimir turns his horse. He leaves the sacred cradle of his dynasty to rot further. He needs a new base, cheap, defensible, and sitting on living trade arteries. And such a base exists far to the south. A heavy silver goblet scrapes across rough parchment with a dull thud. From the center, where faded ink marks the burned cities of Poznan and Gniezno, it moves far to the south, to a point where the Vistula River bends beneath a high, rocky hill. Casimir removes his hand from the goblet. The decision is made. To understand the weight of this gesture, you have to stop thinking in terms of modern logistics and see the world through the eyes of an 11th century man. Gniezno wasn't just an administrative center you could pack up and move with an archive and some officials. It was the sacred assembly point of the entire nation. The bones of the Piast dynasty's founders lay there. The first archbishopric was there. In the medieval mindset, abandoning the graves of your ancestors and the site of the first coronation meant publicly admitting your own failure. A ruler who lost the sacred capital in the eyes of the people lost the divine mandate to rule. Tradition demanded that Casimir drive the first stake into the ashes of Gniezno, set up camp, and swear not to move until the Christian cathedral was rebuilt. But Casimir isn't a hero from a chivalric romance. He's a crisis manager with an empty imperial credit chest. He coldly assesses his assets. Rebuilding Greater Poland would require resources he simply doesn't have. He needs timber for construction, thousands of laborers, years of peace. All around him are hostile forests where pagans hide, and the 1,000 heavily armed German mercenaries at his back cost too much. They need fodder and silver every single day. Sitting on a pile of ashes for the sake of symbolism means going bankrupt in the first year. So Casimir writes off the cradle of his dynasty as a loss. He gives the order to turn the marching columns around and head south, to Lesser Poland, to Krakow. When the German cavalry enters Krakow, the local elite doesn't greet the exile with bread and salt. For the last few years, the nobles of Lesser Poland had lived without taxes and without harsh orders from the center. Now a young Piast, backed by foreign swords, arrives on their land and declares that from now on, this will be the new capital. Casimir doesn't seek consensus. He seizes the rocky hill above the Vistula by force. German steel works more effectively than any diplomatic persuasion. The choice of Krakow was purely rational. The Bohemian prince Bretislav, who had passed through on his destructive march, had looted this city, but he hadn't razed it to the ground with the same methodical hatred he showed the northern capitals. The basic infrastructure here survived. Geography also played in Casimir's favor. Krakow stood at the crossroads of key trans-European trade routes, from Regensburg and Prague eastward to Kiev. Whoever controlled this intersection could collect tolls and fill the treasury with hard cash. And finally, there was Wawel Hill itself, a massive outcrop of limestone above the river, a perfect natural fortress, far easier for 1,000 German knights to defend than the wooden strongholds on the northern plains. The sharp clang of iron pickaxes on stone echoes across the river valley. Casimir launches a massive construction project. He doesn't restore the archaic wooden and earth ramparts of the Slavic type. He builds according to Western models, turning Wawel into a gigantic construction site. Thousands of local residents are driven to the quarries. The air above the hill grows thick with white construction dust. It settles in a heavy layer on the dark cloaks of the imperial mercenaries, on the muzzles of the war horses, on the prince's own hair. This pervasive dust is the smell of a new Poland. Casimir lays the foundation for a new cathedral and raises stone walls. He creates a new center of power from scratch, physically anchoring the state to solid limestone, not to the ashes of past mistakes. If you think about it, it's to this cold calculation that we owe the image of Polish history we know today. Wawel Castle would become the absolute heart of the country for the next 500 years, the site of lavish coronations, political triumphs, and the royal burial vault. Krakow would transform into one of the cultural capitals of Europe. And all this splendor began not with an ancient prophecy, but with the fact that in the year 1039, one ruler simply didn't have enough money to rebuild his old office. The new capital is founded. The stone walls are rising. Casimir has a base, protected by a hill and a first-class army. It would seem the first, hardest stage of his return is complete. But one day, standing on the unfinished tower of Wawel and looking northeast to where the Vistula disappears into the endless forests of Mazovia, Casimir grasps a harsh truth. Having a capital and mercenaries doesn't make you the ruler of a country, especially when, beyond that river, Someone else is already collecting taxes, minting his own silver coin, and commanding an army that's every bit your equal. Casimir wasn't the only one who decided to use the death of the old state as a launching pad, and his competitor was doing a lot better. The broad lead-gray Vistula splits the world of the 11th century in two. If you stand on its western bank, charred logs, peasants tearing down crosses and trampling the embers of old pagan sites, poverty, fear, and primal chaos. But shift your gaze to the eastern bank. There, beyond the cold river waters, rise the sturdy, freshly hewn walls of the fortified town of Płotsk. Guards stand on the watchtowers. They don't look like a starving militia. They wear clean, quilted gambesons. Their spear tips gleam, and meat simmers in cauldrons over the fires. Here in Mazovia, there is no apocalypse. Here, the economy works. In the great hall of Płotsk Castle sits a man. He is impeccably dressed. On his shoulders are heavy wool and fine linen brought from eastern markets, a luxury almost unattainable right now, even for the rightful Prince Casimir, who is swallowing lime dust on a construction site in Krakow. The man slowly runs his fingers through silver coins. The clink of metal echoes through the quiet room. These aren't imperial denarii, worn Arab dirhams, or old piast money. This is his own local coinage, the ultimate marker of independence. The man's name is Miecław, a former royal cupbearer and now the sole master of his own sovereign state. While young Casimir was knocking on doors in Germany, negotiating with the emperor for a loan to save the country, Miecław built a competing firm, right on the ruins of the old one. And he did it flawlessly. When the royal court fled, and a wave of spontaneous violence swept through the central provinces, Miecław didn't hide in the forests. He opened the borders of his Mazovia to refugees, and not to peasants. Across the Vistula flowed the most valuable resource of the collapsed Piast monarchy, human capital. Surviving bishops fled. Governors who knew how to keep tax records and organize logistics fled. Hundreds of knights from the old elite retinue, whose estates had been burned by the rioting mob, fled. Miecław took them all in. He gave them shelter, security, and new positions. In return, he got a ready-made, high-class state apparatus. He didn't need to teach people from scratch how to administer territories. They had been doing it their whole lives. The former cupbearer simply picked up the discarded administrative machine and wired it directly to himself. Here we encounter one of the most persistent historical illusions surrounding the crisis of 1038. If you open old textbooks or chronicles written by church scribes much later, Miecław is often portrayed as the leader of a pagan reaction. A dark, apostate ruler who led forest savages, threw off the Christian yoke, and plunged the country into barbarism. But modern scholarship paints a completely different picture. Miecław was no pagan fanatic. He was a pragmatist to the bone. Archaeology confirms it. New Christian churches were being built in Mazovia at that time. Bishops sat on the ruler's council, not burning at the stake. For holding centralized power, Christianity, with its rigid hierarchy of one God in heaven, one Lord on earth, was a perfect fit, and the former cupbearer understood this perfectly. So why was he written down as an apostate? Because history is written by the victors, and because, to defend his borders, Miecław entered into an open military alliance with the tribes of the Pomeranians and Prussians. And they were indeed still pagans. But for the Masovian ruler, this contract had no religious subtext. It was hiring military contractors. The Pomeranians provided him with fierce light infantry and a fleet covering his north and east. This is pure geopolitics, business without sentiment. Miecław's state is a clear answer to the central question of our history. Sovereignty really could have been built differently. He proved that a country could be assembled without humiliating bows to the German emperor, without foreign loans and mercenaries, relying only on local resources, flexible alliances, and a reformatted national elite. Mazovia flourished, trade flowed, taxes were collected. Miecław played the king more successfully than the legitimate heir to the throne himself. And Casimir, sitting in Krakow, realized this with terrifying clarity. Reports constantly reached Wawel. Casimir would spread the parchments on his table, compare forces, and tally the balance. The picture was not in his favor. Yes, he had 1,000 heavily armored German knights. That's a devastating battering ram, capable of crushing any opponent on an open plain. But Mazovia is not a plain. It's thousands of square kilometers of swamps, bogs, oxbow lakes, and dense, impenetrable forests. The heavy imperial cavalry would sink knee-deep in that mud. Ambushes by Pomeranian light infantry would exhaust the army on the march. And behind the forests stood fortified towns, defended by veterans of the Piast retinue who knew Casimir's tactics by heart. The mathematics of war was relentless. 1,000 cavalrymen wouldn't be enough to swallow such a corporation. If Casimir threw his Germans into the Masovian swamps and lost, he would lose his only power asset. And then the investor in Goslar would immediately demand repayment of the debt. To eliminate his competitor and reclaim the eastern part of the country, Casimir critically lacked men. He needed a second front, an ally who would strike Miecław from behind. A force capable of fighting in forests and on rivers, a force for whom the Masovian usurper and his Pomeranian mercenaries were just as much of a thorn. Casimir pushes the intelligence reports to the edge of the table. He turns his back to the west, from where his money and his soldiers came. Now the decision lies in the other direction. He needs to look east, to where, beyond the wide Dnieper, an empire is gathering strength, an empire whose army could tip any local balance. Casimir stands by the narrow window of the unfinished Wawel Tower. The wind rising from the Vistula carries dampness and cold, but the prince doesn't step away from the arrow slit for long stretches. He's looking east. If you spread the political map of the 1040s across a table, Casimir's position looks hopeless. On the western border looms the German emperor, his chief creditor and strict overseer. To the south sits the Bohemian prince Bretislav, who has bitten off wealthy Silesia and enjoys impunity. In the very center of the country, the usurper Miecław has dug in, commanding a functioning economy and an obedient army. The ring is closed. Casimir's 1,000 German mercenaries are an excellent tool for holding a single stone fortress, but they're far too few to wage an offensive war on 3 fronts through forests and swamps. To break out of this logistical dead end, Casimir needs an ally, and not just a sympathetic observer, but a heavyweight. A player who fears neither the Czechs nor the Germans nor the Masovian marshes. Casimir's gaze turns toward Kiev, toward Yaroslav the Wise. In school textbooks, Yaroslav will remain a monumental figure, the builder of St. Sophia Cathedral, the creator of the Rus Justice Code, and an enlightener. But for Casimir, the Kievan prince is first and foremost the CEO of a vast militarized corporation, a man capable of fielding infantry and cavalry that can simply crush the Masovian separatists through sheer numbers. But geopolitics is a market. Why would Yaroslav invest his troops and money in an exile sitting on the ruins of someone else's capital? Here, it's logical to recall old grievances. Just 20 years earlier, Casimir's grandfather, Boleslav the Brave, had defeated Yaroslav's own armies, stormed Kiev, and hauled away colossal plunder along with the Chervan cities. You'd think the Rurikids would be celebrating the final collapse of the Polish state. But in high politics, there's no room for sentiment or historical memory when the security of current borders is at stake. Let's look at the map from the Kievan chambers. For Yaroslav, the problem lies on Rus' western frontiers. The Masovian usurper, Miecław, having broken away from Poland, isn't sitting idle. He's actively pursuing diplomacy and forming military alliances with Lithuanian, Prussian, and Yatvingian tribes. A powerful Balto-Masovian alliance is taking shape. For Kiev, this independent, aggressive confederation right on its doorstep is a direct threat to trade routes and borderland stability. Yaroslav has absolutely no use for a strong Mazovia. What he needs is a predictable, loyal neighbor who will control the buffer zone and cause no trouble. A weak Casimir, dependent on external support, fits this role perfectly. The interests of the two rulers align completely. One needs an army to reclaim his country. The other needs peace on his western border. All that remains is to formalize this deal legally. In the Middle Ages, interstate contracts weren't sealed with mere signatures on parchment. The risk of sudden betrayal was too great. The only ironclad guarantee of a pact was blood, the scratch of stiff goose quills on dense parchment, the sharp, sour smell of hot wax as heavy princely seals are pressed into it. Casimir's envoys in Kiev are recording the terms of one of the era's most cynical and pragmatic treaties. A double dynastic alliance is concluded. Casimir takes Yaroslav the Wise's sister, Maria Dobroniega, as his wife. As a reciprocal move, he gives his own sister, Gertrude, in marriage to Yaroslav's son, Izyaslav. This is a classic merger of assets. Gertrude is not merely a valuable hostage. She is the daughter of King Miecław II, raised in exile in Germany, possessing an excellent Western education. Giving her away to distant Kiev means physically binding the Piast dynasty's policies to the interests of the Rurikids. Casimir trades the antiquity of his lineage for military protection. He gains legitimacy in the East, protection from Kievan raids, and most importantly, Yaroslav's firm promise to send regiments for a full-scale war against the Masovian separatists. The treaty is signed, the seals have cooled. Casimir has made his move on the geopolitical board. He has broken his diplomatic isolation without spending a single soldier of his own. Couriers gallop westward, carrying news of the completed deal to the rising city of Krakow. And soon after them, the life-saving eastern tranche begins to move. Heavy wagon trains loaded with Kievan silver, Byzantine fabrics, and the Orthodox retinue of the new Polish princess set their course for Wawel. The clatter of hooves on Wawel's uneven cobblestones is swallowed by the murmur of voices. Peasants, herded in to build the new fortress walls, lower their pickaxes. For years, they've seen nothing but burned villages, muddy roads, and soldiers in worn-out mail. What rides through the gates of Krakow in the year 1043 seems to them like a vision. Wawel Hill at this time is a grim, pragmatic construction site. Everywhere there's gray limestone dust, scaffolding, the shouts of overseers, and the clang of weapons from German mercenaries patrolling the approaches to the castle. Krakow is utilitarian. It still resembles a forward military camp more than a monarch's residence. And against this backdrop of gray stone and drab cloth, patches of deep purple, crimson, and gold suddenly flash. Heavy Byzantine silk. Maria Dobroniega, sister of the Kievan prince Yaroslav the Wise, has arrived in Poland, the new wife of Casimir. The Kievan cortege brings with it not just a dowry of ingots and coins. Along with Maria, an entirely different, profound Eastern culture ascends Wawel. The air around the wagons smells different, pungent frankincense and unfamiliar Eastern incense, their aroma mingling with the familiar scent of wet autumn wood and horse sweat. For Casimir, this time becomes a brief respite. For the first time in years, the roar of war and the dry negotiations with creditors give way to music and wedding feasts. Here it's worth stepping back from the grand geopolitics. We're used to seeing Casimir solely as a cold crisis manager, but Maria's arrival lets us see the Piast court from another angle. The Kievan princess brings with her Orthodox monks, Cyrillic books, and church vestments embroidered with gold. The harsh, strictly masculine atmosphere of a military camp is diluted by the complex life of a royal court. Alongside German commanders who understand only the language of force and orders, there appear people chanting Byzantine hymns. A deathly tired country gets, for a short time, the illusion of normalcy. It turns out that in a palace, you can not only plan military campaigns, but also live. However, for Casimir himself, even this respite is, first and foremost, a tool. By taking a Rurikid as his wife, he receives not only a firm promise from Yaroslav the Wise to send regiments for the war against the Mazovian usurper Miecław, he buys the highest form of legitimacy. Yesterday's exile, who stood with his hand out in the antechamber of the German emperor, is now related to one of the most powerful dynasties in Eastern Europe. In the eyes of the Polish elite and its neighbors, Casimir's status changes instantly. The marriage to Maria is a seal that certifies his rights. Now he is not just an imperial vassal placed on the throne by foreign bayonets. He is a legitimate monarch recognized by the East, an equal among equals. The celebrations end. The Byzantine silk is carefully folded into new chests.
The Kievan silver is weighed on heavy scales and carried away to the state treasury. It would seem the plan worked flawlessly. The diplomatic isolation is broken. East and West are balanced. From the east, allied Kievan druzhinas are already ready to march to the borders of Mazovia. But any mercenary army has one mathematical peculiarity. It burns through money at the speed of a forest fire. The 1,000 German knights sheathed in steel who hold Krakow and guard Casimir himself are not fighting for his dynastic rights. They are fighting for silver, and they demand payment every day, for every man, for every replaced horseshoe, for every broken lance. The Kievan princess's dowry is a large but one-time investment, and the war with Miecław hasn't even entered its decisive phase. One morning, Casimir descends into the cellars of Wawel. He opens the state treasury and sees what any ruler who relies on foreign bayonets fears most: the bottom of the chest. The silver is gone. And armed men who stop getting paid very quickly stop being your army. The dull scrape of metal against dry wood. The commander of the German mercenaries lowers the lid of the chest and lifts his eyes to Kazimierz. In the cellars of Wawel, a heavy, tangible silence settles. The silver is gone. Maria Dobronieg's dowry from Kiev was generous, but any standing army has a simple math to it. 1,000 knights clad in steel isn't 1,000 men. It's 1,000 war horses, 1,000 squires, remounts, fodder, chainmail repairs, and replacement of broken lances. This machine devours budgets at a terrifying rate. And now, just one step away from the decisive battle against the Mazovian usurper, the treasury is empty. For an 11th century mercenary, a lack of payment means an automatic contract termination. Kazimierz has no time for lengthy tax collection. The old tribute system collapsed along with the state, and he hasn't built a new one yet. If he doesn't find a way to pay right now, 1,000 of Europe's finest warriors will simply turn around. Best case, they'll plunder Krakow and head home. Worst case, they'll offer their swords to Miecław, who has no money problems at all. Kazimierz faces a choice that forces him to abandon everything his ancestors taught him. The old Piast monarchy, built by his grandfather Boleslav the Brave, operated on the principle of rigid centralization. All land, all peasants, and all resources belonged exclusively to the prince. The prince collected tribute into his strongholds, and from those stores he fed, watered, and armed his retinue. A družinnik was completely dependent on the ruler. He received his status and wealth directly from the prince's hands. This guaranteed absolute personal loyalty. Kazimierz understands that the old system can't be brought back. He has no centralized storehouses and no logistics. But he does have something else. He has land. Vast, empty, burned-out territories. Still fertile, though. And the prince enacts a reform that will forever change the country's DNA. He disbands part of the expensive imperial mercenaries. They've completed their initial task, and he has nothing to pay them with. To the remaining foreigners, and most importantly, to the veterans of his old Polish retinue, he offers an unprecedented deal. He will no longer pay them in silver. Instead, he gives them land, villages, fields, and the peasants who live on them. The warrior receives this land as a lifelong holding. The peasants will now feed not the prince, but this knight personally. In return, the knight pledges to appear for war at the monarch's first call, fully armed. In essence, Kazimierz takes a massive state corporation and hands out controlling stakes to his security contractors. If you want to see the moment when Old Poland physically transforms into New Poland, don't look for it on battlefields. Look at the former princely wastelands. Squads of armed men ride out into the fields. In their hands are rough hemp ropes. They begin methodically measuring out hectares. The silence over the valleys is broken by a rhythmic, heavy thud of wooden mallets. The new owners are driving boundary posts into the Polish loam. That sound is the death knell of the Piast's absolute power. By giving away the land, Casimir saved the country, but he laid a time bomb under the foundation of the monarchy. A knight who receives his own land and peasants ceases to be an obedient družinnik. He becomes a feudal lord. His loyalty to the crown is now conditional on a contract. This is where the system is born that, centuries later, will lead to the famous Szlachta liberties and the power of the landed gentry. But right now, the reform worked instantly. Be that as it may, Kazimierz's reform worked instantly. The funding problem was solved. The army no longer required hard currency. The army fed itself. What's more, the motivation of these men changed radically. A German mercenary fights as long as it's profitable. But a man who's just been measured out a plot of fertile land and told it's his children's inheritance will fight for that land with a completely different ferocity. Kazimierz got exactly what he needed: a motivated, heavy territorial cavalry ready to defend their new holdings. The external investor was satisfied. The internal mechanism was set in motion. Now it was time to test the new feudal machine in action. Casimir shifts his gaze from the boundary posts back eastward to where Miecław sits beyond the Vistula. Two armies are poised to clash. But the war in Mazovia is no tournament on an open field. It's a war in impassable swamps, where from behind every tree a short Pomeranian arrow can fly into the back of a heavy knight. The fog over the Vistula stands like a dense, wet wall. In this cold, white milk, sounds become distorted. You can hear the muffled clang of iron, the heavy, rhythmic squelch of mud under the hooves of hundreds of war horses. Casimir's army slowly advances east along the river, deeper into the territory of the usurper Miecław. The silence is torn apart by a short, dry whistle. An arrow flies out from the reeds and strikes a German knight in the back with a ringing clang. The rider lurches in his saddle. No battle cry, no sound of a horn, only the rustle of parting branches. The archer has already vanished into the forest. The year is 1041. Casimir is leading his army into his first major campaign against Mazovia. Historians will call this clash the Battle of Pobiedziska, though for the people of the 11th century it looked nothing like a classic European battle. It was an exhausting, dirty reconnaissance by fire. In Casimir's hands is a perfect instrument, 1,000 German mercenaries clad in steel, and the first units of his new heavy cavalry, who had just been granted land. By Central European standards, this is a steamroller. Such cavalry is built for open fields. They form a wedge, build up speed, and simply punch straight through the enemy formation, shattering lances and crushing infantry with their mass. But Miecław has no intention of playing by those rules. The former royal cupbearer knows exactly who he's fighting. He himself once paid the bills for similar mercenaries at the court of Miecław II. Miecław understands. Leading the Masovian militia and their Pomeranian allies onto open ground against imperial knights means ending the war in 20 minutes. So he makes the only correct move. He makes geography fight for him. 11th century Mazovia is not fields and meadows. It's endless, damp primeval forests, crisscrossed by dozens of rivers, oxbow lakes, and impassable swamps. Miecław pulls his main forces deep into this territory, acting like an invisible puppeteer. Imagine yourself in the place of one of Casimir's heavily armed horsemen. You're carrying 15 kilograms of cold chainmail. In one hand, a heavy lance, in the other, a massive kite shield. Your warhorse, used to the solid ground of Saxony, sinks into the Masovian loam, up to its fetlocks. Maintaining formation is impossible. The trees break up the ranks, and from behind those trees, the short bows of the pagan Pomeranians keep striking. Miecław uses the tactic of 1,000 cuts. His light infantry attacks the supply wagons, cuts off supply lines, kills foragers, and disappears before the heavy cavalry can even turn to charge. The Masovian ruler is deliberately dragging Casimir into a guerrilla war in the swamps. For Casimir, this isn't just a military problem, it's an accounting problem. We already know he paid the mercenary commanders with land. But war horses, armor, and fodder still cost an enormous amount of money. Every horse that breaks a leg in the mire, every punctured hauberk, it's an irreplaceable loss of an asset. Miecław is coldly grinding down Casimir's elite army against his landscape. The usurper can afford to lose cheap light infantry by the hundreds. For Casimir, every night counts. The Battle of Pobiedziska and the early skirmishes show the prince a brutal truth. His armored battering ram is useless here. Miecław is dug in too deep. To pry him out of Płock break the Masovian fortifications, and destroy the light Pomeranian infantry in the forests, Casimir doesn't need lone knights clad in steel. He needs mass. He needs infantry that knows how to fight in the same mud. He needs light cavalry capable of chasing down the pagans in the woods. Standing in a soaked camp somewhere on the border of Mazovia, Casimir realizes his own forces won't be enough. But he has a document with heavy wax seals, and a wife who brought Byzantine silk to Wawel. The time for diplomacy is over. It's time to demand that Kiev fulfill its contract. Casimir sends messengers east. He calls for Yaroslav the Wise. The decisive battle is inevitable, but before two monarchies crush the Masovian separatist, we need to see how high politics, contracts, and land grants have already begun to change the lives of those no one ever asked. The lives of people whose names will never make it into the imperial chronicles. A clod of wet soil crumbles in calloused fingers. The air smells the way it only does in early spring: melted snow, damp roots, and freshly turned furrows. A former prince's warrior stands at the edge of a field somewhere near Krakow. He's not wearing his usual chainmail, just a simple linen shirt and a woolen cloak. A local peasant shifts his weight from foot to foot, eyeing this armed man warily. A man who, for some reason, isn't demanding an immediate tribute, but is instead surveying the plowland like he owns it. Right here, on this nameless patch of loam, Casimir's grand geopolitics takes physical form. Before, the state was something distant. It materialized twice a year in the form of a mounted troop that took the grain and rode back to the capital. Now, everything is different. This armed man isn't leaving, he's staying. He makes the peasants cut down the forest and builds himself a fortified wooden manor, a knight's grodeck, on the hill right behind the village. Now this is his land, and the peasants are his people. He needs to buy new chainmail, replace broken lances, and raise expensive war horses, and for that, the land has to yield more grain. So the new master forces the village to clear the wasteland, chop down the thickets, and expand the fields. Agriculture starts to grow, not because of some magical new technology, but because a man with a sword has, for the first time, become personally blood invested in the harvest. At the edge of the field, after the work is done, they sit down to eat. The knight breaks a coarse, dark loaf of unsifted rye bread and hands half to the peasant. A strange, purely pragmatic bond forms between them. The peasant feeds the warrior, and the warrior protects the peasant from bandits and neighboring lords, because now this is his personal blood asset. No one's going to let a village burn if your ability to buy armor depends on its harvest. In this quiet, almost idyllic picture lies the core of a nation's survival. The state stopped hanging over the people like a threat from an unreachable capital. It came down to earth. It broke apart into thousands of private estates and sank its roots into this loam. Casimir created a system where every single knight was personally invested in the security of his own little piece of Poland. The country got a breather. The wounds began to heal. But every breather has an end. The winter crops haven't sprouted yet. A cool autumn morning is shattered by a long,
low sound. From Wawel Hill, passed from outpost to outpost, through forests and new knightly estates, the prince's horn sounds. The muster. Casimir gave them the land. He gave them the peasants and the right to collect the harvest. Now it's time to pay up on the venture contract. Time to drop their fields, saddle their heavy horses, put on 15 kilos of iron, and ride east.
To where, beyond the Vistula, the Masovian separatist Miecław sits, this time to finish him off for good. The sun of the year 1047 glints off thousands of steel helmets. That light, blinding the defenders of Mazovia, comes from two directions at once. From the west, crushing sparse barriers and forcing rivers, slowly, inexorably, like a heavy press, the German-Polish knights of Casimir advance. Their ranks are even, their shields locked together into a solid wall. And from the east, from beyond the Bug River, a thick dust rises. There the infantry and light cavalry of Yaroslav the Wise are marching. The Kievan allies are closing the trap. Miecław, the former cupbearer, now the sovereign ruler of Mazovia, stands before his army. He sees this double blow. He sees how the pincers of great European politics are closing right now around his perfect startup. He was neither a fool nor a savage. He built a strong economy. He gathered the remnants of the Piast administration. He hired fierce Baltic pagans. If his enemy had been only Casimir with his 1,000 Germans, Miecław would have drowned them in the Mazovian swamps, as he had already done at Pobiedziska. But against the combined might of two monarchs, an empire from the west and Kiev from the east, a local project cannot stand. This is not a question of valor or tactics. This is a question of mass. Geopolitics simply crushed him with its math. The battle begins. And this is not a tournament fight between equals. This is a methodical, industrial annihilation. Imagine this chaos not from a bird's eye view, but from inside the formation. The air is thick with sweat and blood. Your ears ring from 3 languages, all blended into one continuous animal roar. German commands from Casimir's officers, abrupt orders in Polish, and the foreign, guttural cry of the Kievan Druzhina striking from the flank. The pagan Pomeranians, Miecław's allies, hurl themselves at the wall of German shields. Their light javelins and short swords are powerless against heavy armor. German spears pierce their ranks straight through. The Pomeranian formation breaks. They realize this is not a guerrilla raid, but a meat grinder, and they begin to fall back. Miecław watches his front collapse. He throws his last reserve into battle, that same old Piast retinue he had taken in. But they clash with Casimir's new army, with those very knights who have already received land and now fight not for silver, but for their right to be masters in this country. And then the resistance breaks completely. We don't know exactly how Miecław died. In such meat grinders, chroniclers rarely have time to record the dying words of the defeated. The Chronicles state the finale briefly and dryly. The usurper's army was destroyed, and he himself fell on the battlefield. But along with him, on that swampy grass soaked in blood,
something greater than just a man dies. The last alternative dies. Miecław proved that Poland could have been saved differently, without external management. But he lost. And now the victor, Casimir, a ruler relying on German silver and Kievan swords, becomes the sole legitimate master of Greater and Lesser Poland, and now of Mazovia. The core of the country is united. Casimir returns to Wawel a victor. For the first time in nearly 10 years, the country breathes freely. But to the south, beyond the mountains, one old thorn remains, and that thorn aches more and more with each passing day. A cold wind from the southern mountains howls against the narrow windows of Wawel Castle. Casimir stands at a stone arrow slit. Behind him lies a unified country. Mazovia has been subdued. Miecław is dead. The revolts have been crushed. In the fields of Greater and Lesser Poland, new knights are bringing in the harvest, and the peasants are getting used to the law having weight again. The system is working. The state, which just 10 years ago had been ground to dust, is once again generating resources. But Casimir stares south for long stretches, to where beyond the horizon lie the lands of Silesia. If you look at a map of the Piast state in 1048, Silesia looks like a gaping wound. It's not just a piece of land, it's the richest province, the economic hub that had fed the Polish army for generations. And right now, that province is in the hands of the Bohemian Duke Bretislav, the very same man who sacked Gniezno and led thousands of Poles into slavery. Silesia is a phantom pain, a political itch that won't let Casimir sleep easy. The solution seems obvious. The Polish Duke now has battle-hardened cavalry. He has a secure rear. The logical move would be to immediately turn the regiments south, strike at the Bohemian garrisons, and take back what's his. But Casimir doesn't give the order to advance. The regiments stay in their barracks. To understand the nature of this paralysis, we need to look at the balance of power in Central Europe. Casimir is tied hand and foot, not by the enemy's military superiority, but by a legal contract. While the Polish Duke was fighting in the Masovian swamps, the German Emperor Henry III, that same investor who gave Casimir his starting capital, hadn't been idle. The emperor didn't like that Bretislav was acting like an independent predator. German troops taught Prague a harsh lesson. Bretislav was defeated, swore an oath of fealty, and became an official vassal of the empire. And right there, the geopolitical trap snaps shut. Bretislav is now a subject of the emperor. Silesia, which he holds, is de facto under imperial protectorate. Casimir is also a vassal of the emperor. To Henry III, they're both hired managers running neighboring branches. Attacking Silesia now wouldn't just be a war with Bohemia, it would be a direct, open violation of the contract with the most powerful man in Europe. It would be a rebellion against his only sponsor. A brutal conflict unfolds in Casimir's mind. The crisis manager's logic tells him, stop. You survived. You have Krakow and Poznan. Don't anger the emperor. If you break the ban, Henry III could simply cut off funding, revoke the loyalty of the German knights, or worse, order Bretislav and the other neighbors to tear your country apart again. The risk is absolute. But there's another logic, the logic of blood. Casimir is a Piast. His grandfather, Boleslav the Brave, dictated terms to the empire itself. His ancestors united these lands not to obediently watch foreigners collect taxes in Wrocław. Casimir understands. If he accepts the loss of Silesia, Poland will forever remain a political eunuch, a truncated, second-rate buffer zone on the border of great empires. He can't just be a good accountant if he wants to go down in history as a monarch. This is where the hero's main internal transformation happens. Outwardly, he's still the same calculating ruler in a gray cloak. But inside him, the submissive beggar who stood with his hand out in Goslar finally dies. A predator awakens. He decides that sovereignty isn't given for good behavior. You take it by force, and then you make the world accept the fact. At the same time in Prague, the Bohemian Duke Bretislav is enjoying a rare moment of peace. His residence breathes confidence. Bretislav pays his tribute to the imperial treasury on time. He knows how the bureaucracy of the Holy Roman Empire works. If you're loyal and pay your taxes, the imperial legions guarantee the inviolability of your borders. Bretislav remembers Casimir. He remembers that frightened boy whose mother fled to Germany with wagon trains of gold. He remembers the ragged exile. In the Bohemian ruler's worldview, Casimir is just a German puppet, a loyal attack dog of the empire that would never dare slip its leash and bite without its master's command. The guards on Bohemia's northern borders serve in a relaxed, rear echelon mode. Why expect an attack from someone who's been strictly forbidden to attack? The Bohemian Duke misses one thing. He's judging the Casimir of 10 years ago. He doesn't understand that a man who pulled his country back from the ashes is no longer afraid to risk everything. Casimir himself has a blind spot too. He's sure that history doesn't judge winners. The Piast logic tells him, if the strike is lightning fast, if the Bohemian garrisons fall before an imperial court can be assembled in Goslar, the emperor will simply accept the new reality. Casimir doesn't see that Henry III doesn't forgive freelancing, and for this bold move, Poland will have to pay a price that will weigh like a dead weight on several generations to come. But that comes later. Right now, Casimir steps back from the arrow slit. The long, heavy deliberation is over. The fear of the emperor's wrath retreats before the necessity of making the country whole. The document with imperial guarantees for Bretislav means nothing if the troops backing it up are hundreds of miles away. Quick footsteps echo through the corridors of Wawel. Casimir gives orders quietly, almost in a whisper. There will be no declaration of war, no diplomatic notes, no open muster of the militia. The cavalry must march tonight, without banners and without unnecessary noise. It is the year 1049, and the Polish Duke is preparing to stab the system that created him in the back. The dull, rhythmic thud
of 1,000 hooves on frozen ground. November 1050. The air is so cold that the horse's breath settles as frost on the metal plates of armor. The Polish cavalry is moving south. No campfires at rest stops, no loud commands, only the creak of leather saddles and the quiet jingle of bridles. Casimir is leading his regiments toward the border of Silesia. In this moment, he's crossing more than just a geographical boundary. He's stepping over a line that in 11th century politics means certain death. Casimir is violating a direct, unambiguous prohibition from his venture capitalist, the German emperor. He's going to seize assets from Bohemia, which, like Poland, is a vassal of the empire. Silesia is the richest province, the economic hub that the Bohemians have controlled for over a decade. Bretislav's local garrisons are serving in a relaxed, rear echelon mode. No one expects an attack. Bretislav is absolutely certain that the imperial treaty is an ironclad shield. In his worldview, Casimir is a compliant executor who would never dare to strike without approval from above. The guards on the wooden walls of Wrocław and other Silesian strongholds aren't even looking north. But they forget one rule: contracts only work when there's a force behind them capable of applying sanctions here and now. And the imperial legions are far away. The strike is swift and merciless. A thick, red glow of fires rises over the Silesian strongholds, one after another. Casimir doesn't get bogged down in long sieges. The new Polish army, where experienced German mercenaries fight shoulder to shoulder with the newly landed gentry, functions as a single mechanism. Siege ladders slam into the wooden walls with a dull thud before the sentries can even raise the alarm. Casimir is using the main principle of any successful hostile takeover. Speed matters more than brute force. You don't need to destroy your competitor's entire army. You need to physically occupy the disputed asset and hang your own lock on it before the regulatory bodies can intervene. The takeover has to become a fait accompli. Prague Castle, a few days later. Bretislav crushes a parchment with a dispatch from the northern borders in his fist. A heavy silence hangs in the hall. The Bohemian ruler, who just recently was plundering Polish capitals with impunity and leading thousands of people into slavery, is now experiencing something close to shock. His perfect system has been cracked. The mutilated, ravaged Poland he had long written off has just bitten off Bohemia's most valuable province. But Bretislav's reaction is telling. He doesn't shout at his governors or sound the immediate call for a militia. In the 11th century, assembling a regular army for a counterstrike takes months of complex logistics. Casimir has already dug in within the Silesian fortresses. Dislodging him with a quick strike won't work. Bretislav makes a different move, a move that, in a corporate war, hurts worse than a sword. He summons his scribes. The Bohemian prince drafts an official complaint to his suzerain, Emperor Henry III. Bretislav is shifting the military conflict into the arena of a legal tribunal. Casimir's military operation goes flawlessly. Silesia is reclaimed. The territorial core of the Piast state, torn to pieces 10 years ago, is finally stitched back together.
Casimir has proven to his new elite that he's a strong leader, capable of reclaiming lands, not just giving them away. But there's no celebrating the triumph at Wawel Castle. A rider under the imperial standard enters the gates of the Krakow fortress. He hasn't brought congratulations on the successful end of the campaign. He brings a stiff parchment with a heavy lead seal. Emperor Henry III is furious. His carefully calibrated system of checks and balances in Central Europe has been disrupted. His investments are not behaving according to the approved business plan. The summons the messenger brings doesn't sound like an invitation to diplomatic negotiations. It's a subpoena for a trial. Casimir is ordered to appear in the empire and answer for his unauthorized actions. The lead investor demands an explanation. And Casimir understands perfectly. If he doesn't find the right arguments at this trial, the emperor will simply annul their deal. And then the German regiments will come, not to help Poland, but to finally shut down this problematic project. 1054 A.D. The imperial diet at Quedlinburg. The cold, heavy gaze of Emperor Henry III. Two men stand before the throne. On the right, Duke Bretislav of Bohemia, who has lost control of Silesia. On the left, Duke Casimir of Poland, who has taken that Silesia from him. Both are vassals of the empire. Both await the verdict of their chief investor. Casimir risked everything. By attacking the Bohemian garrisons, he violated a direct ban from his liege lord. In the 11th century, such defiance is punished with punitive expeditions and the loss of your throne. Bretislav holds all the cards. He's the victim of unprovoked aggression, and he demands the return of what was stolen. But Henry III is a pragmatist. He looks at the map of Central Europe not as a knight, but as the CEO of a corporation. He doesn't need a new, full-scale war in the East. He doesn't need the Bohemians to grow strong again at Poland's expense. He needs both of his vassals to depend on him and to be unable to swallow each other whole. Under the vaults of the stone hall, the thick chains groan as they're drawn taut. The enormous scale pans swing. A sharp metallic clang hits the ears. Ingots are being placed on the scales. The emperor pronounces his verdict. This is not a military triumph. This is not a death sentence. This is a dry accountant's compromise. Silesia, the richest territory, the one blood was spilled over, is officially recognized as Polish land. Casimir gets his asset. But in exchange, he is obligated to pay Bohemia an enormous annual tribute, 117 kilograms of silver and 7 kilograms of gold. National pride demands we see this decision as a humiliation. The victor, who fought to reclaim his own ancestral lands, is forced to pay the loser a massive tribute. But if you set aside the emotions and look at the numbers, Casimir pulled off a genius deal. He legitimized his power grab at the highest international level. He acquired a strategic province that would generate tax revenue, and he paid for it with a fixed annual installment. Instead of getting dragged into a multi-year war of annihilation against the combined forces of Bohemia and the Empire, the Polish Duke simply took out a geopolitical mortgage. He bought stability on his western borders with silver. The clang of metal on the scales at Quedlinburg puts a period
on the central mystery of this episode. Can you buy a dead state back to life? Yes, Casimir did it. In 15 years, he went from a fugitive with an empty treasury to a recognized European ruler. He united Greater and Lesser Poland, reclaimed Mazovia, and reconquered Silesia. Poland was back on the map. But that same court at Quedlinburg reveals the hidden price of this resurrection. The absolute monarchy of the early Piasts, where the Duke dictated his will to his neighbors, is gone. To survive, Casimir committed to servicing an eternal foreign debt. And to raise an army capable of reconquering the country, he gave away state land to his knights. He paid for the survival of the state with the state itself. Casimir walks out of the imperial court hall. He has won. But in his country, a new class of armed men holding land contracts has already grown. The country is saved. The machine is running again. But now that machine has too many owners. And very soon, they will demand their share of power. In history textbooks, Casimir I will be remembered by the nickname the Restorer. It sounds noble, but the paradox is that he didn't actually restore anything. The old Piast monarchy, the one where the prince was the absolute master and the retinue fed off fear and constant expansion, had already died back in 1038. What Casimir built on its ruins was an entirely new state. We asked ourselves at the beginning, can you buy a dead country back? You can. Casimir proved that a state can be reassembled if you have a creditor willing to provide startup capital and professional mercenaries. But that purchase came at a price, and I'm not just talking about the tribute to Bohemia. Casimir saved Poland, but to do it, he gave away state land to the knights. He stripped the crown of its primary absolute monopoly. By handing out parcels in exchange for military service, he laid the foundation on which a few generations later an independent Szlachta would rise, a force capable of dictating its will to monarchs and vetoing their decisions. A state isn't some mystical spirit hovering over the forests. It's a deal, a contract between those who sow the rye and those who hold the sword. The early Piasts squeezed the country dry for imperial glory, and as soon as the fear vanished, the system burned to the ground. Casimir survived because he understood stability can't be maintained through coercion alone. By granting benefices to the elite, he made the knights co-owners of the country. And that's exactly what saved Poland from total collapse. Let's go back to where we started, to that heavy iron-bound chest. 15 years ago, German denarii were pulled from chests like that to hire soldiers and march into a scorched land. Now those chests are back in the cellars of the Wawel under construction. But this time, they're filled with Polish silver, ingot by ingot. It's carefully weighed, counted, and loaded onto wagons to be sent over the mountains as the annual payment to Bohemia for the right to rule your own province. A cold stone hall. Casimir stays in it alone. He saved the nation, but he stripped the ruler of that aura of divine impunity. He turned the monarch into a chief accountant, shackled by debts and land contracts. That pragmatic bargain gave Poland a chance to live. But the compromises of fathers often become the curses of their sons. In the next episode, we'll see what happens when a man takes the throne who doesn't want to count silver or answer to anyone else's interests. Casimir's son, Boleslav the Bold, will try to restore absolute power to the crown, and he'll come up against the newly powerful Catholic Church. That conflict will end with the proud monarch personally cutting down the Bishop of Krakow, Stanislav, right at the altar during Mass, and the country will plunge back into the abyss. If you're interested in this kind of look at history, without myths or moralizing, subscribe to the channel and drop down into the comments. What do you think? Did Casimir have another way to rebuild the country without mortgaging its sovereignty and handing out land to mercenaries? Let's discuss. Thanks for watching. See you in the next episode.